We are talking about TikTok and how that affects us here in the US and around the world, especially after the recent US-China TikTok deal. We're going to look at what we know, what we don't know, what everyone seems to have forgotten about, and we really should be remembering. And I have a very special guest today. Thank you so much for joining me, Holly Kellum, host of the Newspeak Channel and media researcher. How are you doing?
Doing well, Kay. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be discussing this very important topic with you, and I am very much looking forward to getting into it.
Holly, do you remember when ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, merged with Musical.ly? It was a popular teen app. Did you ever hear of Musical.ly? I remember hearing about it from my niece who told me about it, and I thought it was the craziest thing at the time.
Musical.ly was one of those apps that I think had a pretty short lifespan, and then ByteDance kind of swooped in and picked it up and really turned it into something similar but different.
It was such a good business move when you think about it. That was in 2018. And I think so many people have already forgotten about that because after they bought that, in the next year, TikTok surpassed 1.5 billion global downloads, and that made it one of the fastest growing apps in the US app stores. In the US, so it was a Chinese company and it basically took over the US market. And this is something I'm concerned about, is that there's been all these lawsuits against TikTok and they're still running, but we don't know what's going to happen to them if the ownership changes.
For me, there's a few main things to be concerned about. So the first is the ownership structure. TikTok is owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance, which used to be called Beijing ByteDance. I mean, Beijing was in the name. And since then, they have really tried to downplay their connections to China. It was not only founded in China, but the government owns what are called golden shares. So there's a very small stake that the Chinese government owns in ByteDance. And we've seen repeated cases of where tech executives based in China are forced to cow down to the Chinese regime when they feel like their ideological control over the population is threatened.
What did you call them? Golden
shares. They're small shares when you look at the percentage, but it gives kind of an outsized control to whoever owns them. And that's the concern with ByteDance, is that it's not just based in China. It's not just subject to Chinese laws, but it actually is, very directly controlled by the Chinese government.
So, with this new deal, September 25th, just this year, President Trump signed an executive order approving this new deal framework where US non-Chinese investors are going to own a majority stake in ByteDance. And apparently less than 20% will be owned by Chinese investors. Now, I wonder if we're talking about golden shares, would even 1% be enough of a golden share for China, which is, America sees China as an adversary. It's not just a trading partner or a travel destination. This is a serious adversary, a national security threat. So even if they own 1%, could that be a golden share, and what could they be doing with that?
More importantly, it's going to come down to how the power dynamics play out. So the former CEO of TikTok, before the current one, Kevin Mayer, he should have been included in the talks with Microsoft and Oracle about these security concerns that, our data here in the US was being stored in Chinese servers, or even servers that Chinese citizens could access. And he was pushed out. He was not included in these negotiations. And you would think, okay, he's the CEO of TikTok. But as people inside the company have reported again and again, the people that are in these positions, it doesn't really reflect the true power dynamics. And so I think that's the concern with a lot of people. It's going to come down to who controls the algorithm, who controls where the data is stored. And to be honest, it doesn't even matter so much where the data is stored as who can access the data.
There's a lot of AI researchers and data collectors who just say all the data's been gathered. And sure, there are still new users joining these platforms every day, and they're they're being tracked and their data's being collected. Younger generations, they're not concerned about their data being collected. So then if we were to put data aside, then we're left with an algorithm, and we don't know who is going to control the algorithm. The public wasn't privy to how these US non-Chinese investors were appointed. We don't know, were they appointed just to maximize dollars for US profit? Are they really going to seriously take mental health and damage that's being done to users into account? Are they going to rewrite the algorithm? They said they're going to retrain it. But I just wonder how many of those factors are really being considered, and more so, are we going to find out after this 120-day window finishes? What do you think?
In theory, what I've read about this deal so far is that the government is supposed to have, a percent stake in the company once this deal closes. I mean, we're, still in the early stages of it, so who knows what it's actually going to look like. But you would hope that the U.S. government, having the best interests of the U.S. citizens in mind, they would be able to control for some of these things like, Chinese influence and, who's accessing our data. And also just frankly, the harm that these algorithms can create. China had passed a law that said that, certain types of software could not be exported. It was considered like a national security risk. And so that's why President Trump was negotiating this deal. He was on the phone directly with Xi Jinping. So, the first question is if China will even let go of this algorithm. Second, is it going to be copied, as I've read? And is there going to be like a US version made? And then my concern with TikTok is the social and emotional harm that this algorithm has produced. So maybe you've seen some videos about children who are on the social media app too much, and they literally develop tics that they cannot control. They will blurt out swear words, they will have seizures, they will do strange things like their hand will just go in the air, and they have absolutely no control over it. And the doctors that have looked into this, they say it's related to their social media usage, specifically TikTok. I think of things like the Tide Pod challenge. That was very dangerous. And yet, if there isn't somebody out there tweaking the algorithm to downplay videos like these, or even, I'm not a fan of censorship, but even removing them if they're really harmful, that can really push society, I think, to a very dangerous place. I teach students, elementary and high school, and what really scared me was how short their attention spans are. I was told by another teacher that even if you're playing a movie, even if you're doing a game, something fun with them, you can't do anything past 15 minutes. Their attention spans just won't hold anything more than that. And that to me is what I think is possibly one of the biggest repercussions of TikTok. And I'm not saying it's just TikTok. YouTube is into shorts. That's on Instagram too. But I see TikTok as creating this model and pushing it even more. I have a 70-plus-year-old father, and you would think he would not be the demographic that would, be addicted to TikTok. He is. And it's those quick, very entertaining videos that he is just constantly served up. And I even see this in myself. Maybe you do too. It's like they just come one after the other. You don't have to do anything. And I'm not on TikTok, but I see that with YouTube. It's just kind of feeding you. And if you don't have the willpower or the, presence of mind to pull yourself away, it's just like crack cocaine. It's almost like you can't help yourself.
Really, that is what we're facing now with social media. All the social media know how slot machines work in casinos, and there's just been decades and decades of research and studies done on how those things work, so much so that the CEOs of those companies that created these social media platforms, they're not letting their own kids use social media because they know that the damage that it's doing. Especially, I think there is a difference between adult minds using it. We have a choice. We're a bit more aware of our choices because our brains are more developed by the time we're 25. You mentioned one of the challenges, the Tide Pod challenge. Another challenge that has been, that there's litigation against TikTok, is the blackout challenge that actually resulted in at least 20 kids dying, self-asphyxiation. In the lawsuit, it's allegedly promoted by TikTok's algorithm. One of the parents who sued, their child was 10 years old when they died. That's not something that we've really seen so much in other social media platforms. There's other examples too about kids being exposed to self-harm content, eating disorder content really quickly, and not just one exposure, but really inundated with that self-harm, so much so that the parents have said that it actually caused the child to take their own life. So it's really extreme. TikTok seems to be really extreme. Some of the differences between TikTok and other social media platforms, you brought up the ownership. That's critical. Another one is the way the feed works in TikTok is it mostly shows you content from people you don't know. Whereas if you're using, say, YouTube or Facebook, certainly Facebook, Instagram, you're seeing content from people that you have chosen to look at, and then the algorithm will show you extra things. Whereas in TikTok, you're seeing content from really mostly strangers. So it's really exposing, especially the young users, to things that they have never even thought of before. And TikTok's algorithm actually adapts much faster than all of the other social media platforms, which makes it feel more addictive. The US-based platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Meta, they actually personalize more slowly based on your network of people that you are following or have liked previously. So the algorithm is really different. They are responding to you so quickly that you're getting that instant gratification at a much higher, faster level than on other platforms.
Yeah. And I think one of the other dangers is that, things that the Chinese government consider sensitive, so the Tiananmen Square massacre, Falun Gong, persecution of Uyghurs, things that they don't want you to know about, have been censored. And actually, there was a representative for the company that admitted that, in addition to pushing harmful content, it's also a way that China can control the narrative about certain things. I've seen studies that show that news consumption on TikTok is on the rise when, it's either plateaued or going down for most social media platforms. And so that's what worries me. I'm all for news consumption, but I think the real danger is if that news is slanted in a particular way, or, certain news is just not being offered to the user. I see that as a pretty big danger.
I think in 2019 was when it became really apparent, which is, well, really the year after ByteDance bought Musical.ly and turned it into TikTok anyway. So it was almost straight away. That was when the Hong Kong protests started. And that's when people started to notice that there was hardly any content about the Hong Kong protests on TikTok when they were going viral on every other single social media platform around the world. But why not TikTok? And then there was the makeup tutorial by the Uyghur makeup artist, and she had 3 videos go viral, and they got either removed or heavily censored on TikTok, and people really started to pay attention. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was even covered on forget which late night comedian covered that controversy, but yeah, that was big news in the US at the time, and I'm glad that it got so much coverage, because if you've been following China issues like I have, it's kind of, you shrug because you kind of know that that's an inevitable result of a Chinese company, catering to a U.S. audience. But yeah, that was very telling, and I'm glad it got as much publicity as it did. There have been leaked guidelines about what kind of content TikTok will censor, and certain content is going to be prioritized no matter what. So then the question becomes, well, what gets priority? With TikTok, it's a question of is the algorithm prioritizing content that the Chinese government thinks is bad for us and maybe is addictive, but also has social emotional ramifications for our country. I mean, I just see this as potentially one of the biggest soft power weapons that China has, because first of all, they have ambitions to take over Taiwan after they've taken Hong Kong. They want to have complete control over religions and, any form of spirituality within its borders. You have the issue of Tibet. You have the issue of, China bullying all of its neighbors, frankly, trying to replace the US as the world superpower. And so if China can, through these soft power means, defeat us in terms of getting us to believe that, first of all, these things aren't worth fighting for, that second of all, China is inevitably going to achieve these things. Third of all, that China is our friend. If China can convince us of these things, it doesn't even have to fire any bullets. And I think that's, to me, one of the biggest issues here. And I think, to be honest, I was surprised President Trump in his first term was trying to ban TikTok on national security grounds, for this, but also for the reasons of data collection. I mean, you think about just the reams of data that they can collect on users, even our locations. If you want to take over a country, this data, I mean, gosh, it's just a gold mine, right? And so I was frankly surprised that Trump did such a 180 on this, because, I mean, from my perspective, it doesn't have anything that makes it a force for good in our society. What do you think? I mean, do you see any redeeming value in having TikTok?
What is the redeeming value of social media these days? That's an important question, because we have moved our lives online, and our lives have become so digitized, and our relationships have become so algorithmic that now it's hard to say that there isn't any redeeming value in that. That's how we are connecting with each other. And unless we go back to and maybe start living like the Amish, it's hard to say how would people survive without social media, just because they've replaced so much. And we've come to a point now where Gen Z they don't know a world without social media. They don't know the connection without social media. There's a lot of memes about the Gen Z stare, right? You've probably seen some of those. And I have a lot of Gen Z relatives and friends, and I can just relate to that. I don't take that stare personally. It's a cultural aspect of a generation that has grown up staring at their phones instead of staring into people's eyes. But older generations really struggle to see that. And then it's easier to kind of look and say, well, what's the redeeming value of this addiction to technology and social media that these younger generations have? Well, that's all they know, and we haven't given them anything better. If we could replace it so that we didn't have all the algorithms that were being moderated by corporations and entities that want to manipulate our minds, then we'd have a very different lifestyle and we'd have very different relationships. But right now, all of our relationships are tied to these overlords who are competing. They're competing for intimacy by putting chatbots into social media and making friendships with algorithms, and relationships with them being AI chatbots and things like that. So social media is just heading into a whole nother world now, and we're going to be seeing more and more complex algorithms coming up. And where we go from here is, oh boy, it's a whole another thing. We'll have to save that for another discussion. I'd love to have you back for that. But back on China, it was John Oliver from last week tonight who did really exposed that makeup tutorial and the censorship by the Chinese Communist Party about the Uyghurs there. He did such a clever segment. But since then, what's happened, right? It's like now there's these lawsuits against it. There's research that's come out saying how harmful it is, but people are still using it because I don't know, what other options do the youth have these days when that's how they're being raised? It's really, really a bigger problem, don't you think?
You know, I read about a very interesting study that found that a majority of the children, and I can't remember the age range that was polled, said that they would actually have no problem giving up TikTok. In fact, they didn't like feeling like they were addicted to it, but they were worried. They had FOMO, the fear of missing out. They didn't want to miss out on what all of their other friends were talking about. They are burned out by it too. They don't want to be addicted to their phones. They want to have real life relationships, but they feel like they can't because all of their friends are talking about what they see on TikTok. The other argument I've seen for keeping TikTok is that TikTok will promote accounts that are small and they will put them in front of a lot of people. And so what TikTok has argued is that it has allowed small US businesses to get a very big following in a very short time. And so the business community, you know, these small businesses that have, you know, really expanded exponentially on TikTok, you know, that their businesses would be hurt. The other thing, which I thought was kind of scary but smart, so once President Trump signed the executive order, I think it was at that stage, TikTok released, the CEO of TikTok released a video telling its users, and I think at that point it was, gosh, I think in the US there was like 100 or maybe over 100 billion users at that time, telling users to contact their members of Congress and stop that executive order or to put political pressure on politicians not to do it. If you are a politician and let's say, you know, your average call volume for a day is 50 calls, and then all of a sudden you're dealing with 1,000 calls because your constituents are calling about TikTok, you know, you take note. You know, if TikTok can convince US citizens that, you know, this is worth fighting for, gosh, I think that's a big political tool for China.
Isn't it funny that we really have these two sides? People say they don't want it, but then they do want it. It's like a drug addiction. People are willing to have the loss that comes from carrying out the hit from the addiction to just get that high, and then they're willing to defend it because there's also the aspect of Americans wanting free speech and the ability to communicate freely. And that leads us to the comparison of the US version and the Chinese version. And when I say Chinese, I'm not talking Chinese language so much because TikTok is being used by people all around the world. It's very popular in Asia, throughout Asia as well, not just the US. But in China, there is a completely different version. It looks the same. The interface and the design is the same, but it's called Douyin, and it actually has differences in the algorithms. And so instead of bringing up saying, call your congressman to save TikTok, it's bringing up every 40 minutes saying, you've been on here for too long, you need to get off. Now, that's for younger users. Under 14 years old in China, they have a maximum 40 minutes a day usage and they're not allowed to use it at night. There's government mandated limits. So the Chinese regime says, this is how much you can use it and we're going to kick you off and we're going to keep reminding you to get off. They turn it off overnight between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. The young people physically cannot access it. So a lot of Americans would say, well, that violates our First Amendment rights. We want access 24/7 because we should be able to choose. But then American parents are saying, well, we need help because our kids are addicted to TikTok because the algorithm is so intentionally addictive. It also shows that the Chinese government knows that TikTok algorithm, the one that is used in the US, is dangerous. The fact that China doesn't allow the same product into its own culture, its own people, to me, it's kind of like a country producing high fructose corn syrup, not giving it to its own citizens, but exporting it around the world to all of the citizens of the other countries, knowing it's going to make them sick and unhealthy and ruin their food and get them addicted to these types of overprocessed sugars. That's how I see TikTok, is really that comparison against something that's knowingly harmful, and they're really cutting off their citizens and just sending out this poison around the world. That's what that contrast says to me. What do you think?
One of the other arguments to keep TikTok, and I've even seen, members of Congress say this, is that, if the US government is allowed to ban social media platforms, as Trump was trying to do, that gives the government way too much control over our life. And I understand that concern. I mean, I think everyone should be concerned about that. But when it comes to, us versus China, it's not like if the US isn't involved, it's going to be some benevolent company that has our best interests at heart. It's going to be, Chinese engineers who, are under Chinese laws, who, China is just a master of using all of its resources, all of its civil resources, to further its goals politically. And as I mentioned before, one of China's goals is to replace the US as the world superpower. And so I think in this case, in this particular case, I do think the greater good is the US government stepping in. But it also doesn't make me terribly comfortable, because I generally believe that there should be a balance. I think the government should play the role of the referee. And I think that, the companies should be subject to U.S. laws that are passed by our Congress and approved by our president and are done in a democratic manner. So I would say, as like a stopgap measure, having the U.S. government, be part of TikTok. Okay, that's maybe a good thing for now. But I have pretty grave concerns about the U.S. government, having too much control. And we saw this, the Twitter files really showed after the pandemic what a strong hand the Biden administration had in terms of getting content either banned, removed, downplayed, or accounts shadow banned on Twitter. And we've now we understand that happened at Google and at Facebook. And so, I think that is a very big, issue. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about, how it should be structured to best protect citizens, but also, keep it independent.
There is a big challenge now between free speech and regulation. I guess that's always been a balance within American society, and at least we can talk about it. In China, you cannot. My newsletter that I put out every week is called Mind Armor with Kay Rubacek. I put that on Substack. It's free to join. Please go and subscribe so that you can actually get all the sources to all of the things that we've talked about in this discussion today. Thank you, Holly Kellum from Newspeak. I hope to have you back soon.
Thanks so much, Kay. This was a great conversation, and there are just so many facets to it. We could talk about it for hours, but I enjoyed it and looking forward to doing this again.
Yes, let's get back to TikTok soon. And don't forget to hit the like, subscribe button, and then click this next video, and I'll see you there.